To understand the story of Greenland, we must cast our gaze back over 1,000 years to the turbulent waters of the North Atlantic. The history of this massive island begins not with a grand royal decree, but with an exile. In the late 10th century, a Norseman known as Erik the Red was banished from Iceland following a violent dispute. Forced to leave his home, he sailed west into the unknown, chasing rumors of a landmass that had been sighted but never explored. What Erik discovered was a land of stark contrasts. While much of it was covered in ice, the deep fjords of the southwest offered something unexpected. During this era, known as the medieval warm period, the global climate was milder than it is today. In these sheltered valleys, Erik found pockets of green, pastures capable of supporting livestock, and birch trees struggling against the wind. He spent 3 years exploring this coastline, seeing the potential for a new settlement far from the laws that had cast him out. However, Erik knew he could not survive alone. To build a thriving community, he needed to convince others to leave the relative safety of Iceland for the edge of the known world. This necessity gave birth to one of history's earliest and most effective marketing strategies. He knew that a name describing a frozen wasteland would attract few volunteers, so he made a deliberate choice. He named the land Greenland, reasoning that people would be more attracted to the region if it had a favorable name. His gamble paid off. In 985 AD, a fleet of ships followed him back to these shores. While many were lost at sea, those who arrived established the eastern and western settlements. They built homesteads, raised sheep and cattle, and constructed churches. For the next several centuries, these Norse communities clung to the edge of the ice sheet, their existence tethered to the promise of that green land. This was the birth of Greenland as a distinct entity in the European consciousness, a settlement founded on an outcast's desperation and a name that promised hope in a harsh environment.
By the 13th century, the fierce independence of the Greenlandic settlers began to fade. To secure reliable trade routes and political protection, the community voted to submit to the authority of the Norwegian crown. This decision formally bound Greenland to Norway, integrating it into a transatlantic Nordic realm. However, just as political stability seemed assured, the environment turned hostile. The medieval warm period, which had allowed the settlements to flourish, gave way to the Little Ice Age. Temperatures plummeted, and the encroaching glaciers began to reclaim the pastures that Erik the Red had once prized. As the climate worsened, the settlements faced an existential crisis. The sea ice thickened, making navigation treacherous and cutting off vital supply ships from Europe. The cattle, unable to graze on the frozen tundra, died off, and the settlers faced severe famine. During this period, the Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, were migrating southward. Unlike the Norse, who struggled to maintain a European agrarian lifestyle in the Arctic, the Inuit were masters of this environment. While the exact details remain a subject of historical debate, the combination of a cooling climate, isolation, and competition for resources led to the total collapse of the Norse colonies. By the 15th century, the European presence in Greenland had vanished, leaving behind only silent stone ruins. For nearly 300 years, Greenland was largely forgotten by the European powers, though it remained technically under the crown. During this time, Denmark and Norway were united under a single monarchy. The definitive shift in sovereignty occurred in 1814 with the Treaty of Kiel, following the Napoleonic Wars. As the dual monarchy was dissolved, Norway was ceded to Sweden. However, a crucial diplomatic detail changed Greenland's fate forever. The treaty stipulated that Norway's ancient overseas possessions, Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands, would not follow Norway, but would remain with Denmark. Thus, by a stroke of a pen in a European treaty, the vast, icy island officially became a Danish territory, even though its original Norse inhabitants were long gone.
With the legal question of ownership settled by the Permanent Court of International Justice in 1933, which ruled in favor of Denmark over Norwegian claims, the Danish government solidified its control over the entire island. In 1953, Greenland's status was constitutionally changed from a colony to an integral county of the Danish realm. However, this political integration ushered in a period of forced modernization that deeply scarred the local population. Copenhagen implemented a policy intended to bring Greenlandic living standards up to par with Denmark, but the execution was culturally destructive. Traditional Inuit hunters were relocated from small settlements to concrete apartment blocks in larger towns. The Danish language was enforced in schools and administration, often at the expense of the native Greenlandic tongue. Many locals felt marginalized and treated as second-class citizens, watching their ancient heritage erode under the pressure of Danification. This social upheaval ignited a fierce nationalist movement in the 1970s. A new generation of politicians demanded the right to determine their own future, leading to the establishment of Home Rule in 1979. This historic legislation transferred authority over internal affairs such as education and the economy from Copenhagen to Nuuk. The drive for autonomy did not stop there. In 2008, a referendum paved a way for the Act on Greenland Self-Government. This act recognized Greenlanders as a distinct people under international law and granted the local government control over the police, the judicial system, and crucially, the island's natural resources. While Denmark retains authority over foreign policy and defense, Greenland has successfully reclaimed the power to govern its own land and its own people.
Today, Greenland stands on the threshold of a new era. The desire for full independence is no longer a distant dream, but an explicit political goal, enshrined in the very laws that currently govern the island. The Self-Government Act provides a legal mechanism for Greenland to become a sovereign nation whenever its people choose to do so. However, the path to total statehood is obstructed by a stark economic reality. Despite possessing autonomy over most domestic affairs, the government in Nuuk remains heavily dependent on Denmark. An annual block grant from Copenhagen covers nearly half of the public budget, funding essential services like healthcare and education. This financial lifeline creates a complex dilemma. Cutting ties with Denmark immediately would likely result in a severe economic collapse, forcing the Greenlandic people to choose between national pride and their standard of living. Complicating this internal debate is the island's rapidly escalating geopolitical significance. As climate change accelerates the melting of Arctic ice, new shipping routes and vast untapped mineral reserves are becoming accessible. This has transformed Greenland into a strategic chessboard for the world's great powers. The United States, Russia, and China have all turned their gaze northward, viewing the island as a crucial pivot point for military security and resource dominance. Greenland now finds itself walking a tightrope. The challenge is no longer just about surviving the elements, as the Norse settlers once did, but about navigating global politics. The leadership must find a way to build a self-sustaining economy, likely through tourism or mining, to replace Danish subsidies, while simultaneously managing the intense interest of superpowers who seek to expand their influence in the Arctic. The story of Greenland, which began with a Viking exile seeking a new home, has evolved into a modern narrative of a small nation striving to carve out its own identity amidst the competing ambitions of the world's giants.